The night was cold and damp when I received the call. It was already past midnight, and the quiet town of Verde had fallen into an unsettling silence. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, sending chills down my spine. Unit 24. We've received a report of a disturbance at the old Torres house. Neighbors say they heard screams, but the house is supposed to be abandoned. Proceed with caution. I knew the Torres house well. It was infamous in Verde. Decades ago, the entire Torres family had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Since then, the house had been the subject of rumors, but as a man of logic, I didn't believe in fantastical stories. Still, the thought of going there in the middle of the night made my stomach churn. I parked my patrol car by the curb. The house stood like a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. I noticed the front door was ajar, creaking in the breeze. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight and radio before stepping out into the cold. As I approached the house, I heard a faint noise, a low, muffled sob. It sounded like a woman. My pulse quickened and my flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the overgrown yard. I hesitated before pushing the door, which opened with a loud creak. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was breathing. "Police," I called, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Is anyone here?" The sobbing grew louder, drawing me deeper into the house. I followed it through dusty, decaying rooms until I reached the basement door. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but the sobbing continued, desperate and forlorn. I had no choice. Someone was in trouble. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. It was pitch dark except for the faint beam of my flashlight. The sobbing abruptly stopped, plunging the basement into an eerie silence. My breath caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered again, struggling to stay lit. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling. Suddenly, something fell to the floor just out of sight. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw a worn backpack. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step forward. The air felt colder now and the tension mounted. Then my flashlight illuminated something on the floor, a series of drag marks leading to the far corner of the basement. My stomach churned as I followed them. When the beam lit up the corner, my breath stopped. There, slumped against the wall, was a woman. Her clothes were tattered and her face was as pale as death. Her eyes were wide open but stared into nothingness. I approached slowly, reaching for my radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at the Torres house, possible victim unresponsive." Before I could finish the call, the woman's head turned toward me. Her mouth opened, and she let out a scream that pierced the darkness. The sound was desperate, filled with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly raised my flashlight, illuminating her anguished face. "It's okay. I'm here," I said, trying to calm her. The woman, visibly terrified, muttered something about a group that had captured her. I felt the horror of the situation intensify. Without thinking, I backed up and reached for my weapon, but there was no time. The woman lunged toward me, her eyes wild, explaining that she had been kidnapped and had managed to escape. I felt the urgency to act. "I'll help you," I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As I turned to run, I heard noises from upstairs, footsteps approaching quickly. Panic seized me as I raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I rushed out of the house, gasping for air. When I reached my patrol car, my hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get away. But before I could start the engine, my radio came to life. "Unit 24, backup en route. What's your status?" I grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "The house. There's a woman. She's been kidnapped." Suddenly, the passenger door of my patrol car creaked open. I froze, slowly turning to look. There, sitting in the passenger seat, was the woman from the basement. Her gaze was intense and full of fear, and before I could react, she pleaded with me to get away, warning me that her captors had followed. Without wasting time, I turned and ran back into the house, looking for a safe place. The next morning, when the backup unit arrived, they found us safe inside the patrol car, exhausted but alive. We had managed to avoid the kidnappers, who were never found. The Torres house remained abandoned, but after that night, the locals knew it wasn't just a ghost story, but a reminder of the horrors that could lurk in the darkness. It was shortly after 3 in the morning when I received the call. It was one of those nights when the city seemed to hold its breath. The roads were slick from a recent storm, and the fog clung to the ground like a shroud. The call came from one of the most remote areas, an isolated stretch of road locally known as the Dangerous Curve. The dispatcher's voice sounded tense, as if there was more to the situation than his words let on. We received a 911 call from a stranded motorist at the Dangerous Curve. She sounded frantic, something about someone standing in the road. A chill ran down my spine. The Dangerous Curve had a bad reputation. It was the site of countless fatal accidents over the years. The sharp bend and poor visibility had claimed many lives. I turned on the lights and sped down the dark road as the fog thickened with each mile. As I neared the Dangerous Curve, I spotted a vehicle, an old sedan with hazard lights blinking faintly through the fog, stopped at the side of the road, as if the driver had left in a hurry. I parked behind it and, flashlight in hand, stepped out into the cold night. The air was thick with the smell of rain and something else, something metallic. I approached the car slowly, shining my light inside. The driver's seat was empty, but there was a purse and a phone on the passenger seat. The driver's door was slightly ajar, as if the driver had left in a rush. "Hello?" I called out into the void. "Police, is anyone there?" Only the fog answered me. I looked toward the road, and as I focused my flashlight, I saw a figure just ahead, standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, her silhouette faint through the mist, her back to me. Something about her posture was unsettling, unnaturally rigid. "Ma'am?" I called out firmly despite the growing unease in my chest. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond, didn't move at all. I took a step forward, my hand hovering near my holster. I shone my light on her again, the beam cutting through the mist. That's when I noticed. The woman appeared to be on the edge of the road as if she were about to fall into the ditch. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain processed the scene. The woman was in shock. "Ma'am?" I called again, my voice cracking slightly. Slowly, the woman began to turn, not stepping or moving, but rotating as if her entire body was being manipulated. When her face came into view, I felt a knot in my stomach. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was empty. She had bloodstains on her face, as if she'd taken a fall or a blow. I approached cautiously. She let out a gut-wrenching scream, a sound full of fear and pain. I stepped back, but quickly understood what was happening. The woman was in a state of crisis. She had become disoriented after the accident, and had likely wandered aimlessly in the fog, which explained her strange behavior. I pulled out my radio to call for an ambulance, but before I could react, she stumbled toward me, her hands reaching out as if seeking help. I didn't hesitate. I caught her to keep her from falling. The woman kept screaming, desperate. Calm down," I said as I tried to soothe her. Looking closer, I noticed a wound on her head, probably caused by the accident. This explained her erratic behavior, her screams, and her confusion. I led her back to the car, and while we waited for the paramedics, I surveyed the scene. The car was in bad shape. Tire marks on the road indicated she had lost control at the curve. In her rush to exit the vehicle, she must have hit her head, which caused her altered state. The fog enveloped everything, and I couldn't shake the chill I felt as I pieced together the situation. The infamous Dangerous Curve held no supernatural mystery. It was merely a death trap on rainy nights with low visibility. The tension in the air was the same any officer feels when facing the unknown, but there were no ghosts, only human fear, accidents, and misunderstandings. I've worked in the Villa Crest region for almost 20 years, and though I've seen my share of dangerous situations, nothing prepared me for that night on the winding road through the dense forests. That road had a dark reputation, not for ghosts, but for mysterious disappearances that, over time, had fueled legends. Some spoke of criminals who took advantage of the road's isolation to prey on those traveling there, especially at night. It was 2 in the morning when I received the call. A woman, frightened and desperate, had dialed 911, claiming someone was following her. I had responded to similar calls before, but something in the woman's voice made my pulse race. Her terror was palpable, as if she truly was in immediate danger. "Please, they're outside, watching me," she whispered between gasps. I turned on my patrol lights and headed to the location. The road was dark, and the thick fog made visibility difficult. As I drove, my mind recalled the cases of unexplained disappearances in that area. Maybe there was more to the stories. Perhaps someone or a group of people was using the legend for their own purposes. The dispatcher reported that the woman's last known location was near mile marker 23. As I approached, I saw a car pulled over at the side of the road, hazard lights blinking. It matched the vehicle described in the call. I stopped my patrol car and got out, my flashlight cutting through the dense fog. Everything was silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The car was empty, the driver's door was open, and the woman's belongings were scattered on the front seat as if she had left in a hurry. I called out her name but received no response. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight but saw no one. Then I heard something move among the trees. I stopped, tense, aiming my light toward the source of the sound, but the fog made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "Police!" I shouted. "If you can hear me, come out!" Nothing, just the sound of the wind. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone was nearby, lurking. I felt a surge of unease, something I didn't often experience in my job. The whisper of the wind and the crackle of branches kept me on edge. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, running toward me. It was the woman, her face contorted with fear, her clothes torn and mud stains covering her. "Help me! They're coming for me!" she screamed, stumbling before collapsing at my feet. I helped her up as she kept repeating that they were chasing her. I tried to calm her down, but her words were unintelligible, a product of her panic. She mentioned several times a group of people following her, figures hiding in the fog, watching her from the forest. As I tried to soothe her, I looked toward the trees and noticed movement in the distance. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. Could it be possible that a gang of criminals was using that area to ambush lone travelers? The mysterious disappearances might have a much more tangible explanation than people believed. "Come on, get in the car," I said, quickly leading her toward the patrol car. Just as we were about to get in, I saw several figures among the trees. They moved carefully, avoiding the vehicle's lights. They were people, but they acted in an organized manner, as if they were experienced in stalking in the dark. This confirmed my suspicions. The road and its legend had been exploited by criminals for their own purposes. I started the patrol car and sped away, but the fog grew thicker. As we drove, I tried to get more information from the woman, but she could barely speak, still in shock. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her pursuers, but there was no sign of them. When we finally reached a safe place, I contacted the station and requested backup. The woman was taken to a nearby hospital for care. In the following hours, several investigations were conducted in the area. Although they didn't find the criminals that night, there was enough evidence, footprints, and traces in the woods to confirm that something sinister was happening there. The disappearances on that road hadn't been the work of ghosts or supernatural beings, but of an organized group that used fear and darkness to prey on the unsuspecting. I've always been skeptical of legends, but now I knew that the real threat wasn't in the myths of the past, but in the reality hidden among the trees of the Villacrest forest. It was a quiet autumn night when I received the call. A single car accident on a remote stretch of road winding through the mountains. The dispatcher sounded concerned. There were no towns nearby, and the closest house was several miles away. However, the person who called 911 said something that intrigued me. "They're outside the car," he whispered, "just watching me." Then the line went dead. I know that road well. It's infamous for accidents, especially on foggy nights like this. The curves can be treacherous and the mist so thick that any misjudgment can be fatal. But something about that call didn't add up. They didn't mention another vehicle or explain why someone would be watching in the middle of nowhere. I turned on my patrol lights and sped toward the location. As I climbed higher, the fog grew denser. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, forcing me to rely more on instinct than sight. When I reached the designated mile marker, I saw a faint glow through the mist, the blinking lights of a car. I pulled over to the side of the road, and as I got out, the cold night air wrapped around me. The car, a silver sedan, had its front end smashed against the guardrail. The driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. With my flashlight in hand, I inspected the surroundings. "Police, is anyone here?" My voice echoed in the fog, but there was no response. My heart started to race as I walked around the car. I saw a phone on the passenger seat, its screen cracked, and an open wallet. Whoever had been there seemed to have left in a hurry. Then I saw the footprints. 2 sets leading away from the car toward the forest, disappearing into the fog. One looked like it was from someone wearing shoes, but the other was barefoot. I crouched down to get a closer look at the barefoot prints. Something was off about them. The toes seemed unnaturally long, and the size of the feet didn't match what one would expect to see. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but before I could speak, I heard a noise coming from the woods. I stood still, shining my flashlight into the dense trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but then I saw someone slowly emerge from the trees. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin, with arms hanging limply at his sides and his head bowed. "Sir? Are you okay?" I called out, cautiously approaching him. He didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly. "Stay where you are," I ordered, though my voice trembled a bit. Something didn't feel right. The man slowly raised his head, and as I shone my light on his face, I saw that he was in bad shape. He looked disoriented, his gaze distant, with no reaction to me. His clothes were torn, and he seemed to have been wandering for hours, if not longer. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something terrible had happened to this man. As I approached, I saw he had superficial wounds on his hands and arms, probably caused by his hurried escape from the car and the rough terrain of the forest. "I'm going to call for an ambulance," I said, but he didn't react. I started to back toward my patrol car when I heard another noise, this time louder, coming from the car. I quickly pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw a second person emerging from the opposite side of the vehicle. A woman, likely the passenger. She was staggering as if she had taken a hard hit. She clutched her side, and when I reached her, I noticed she was injured but conscious. "What happened?" I asked, but she could only mumble something about losing control of the car on a curve. I called the dispatcher to request backup and an ambulance. While we waited, I stayed with them, trying to keep them conscious and calm. As the fog cleared slightly, I realized they were both in shock. There was more to this scene than a simple accident. The woman mentioned seeing shadows in the road just before losing control. Maybe the fog had played tricks on her senses, but from her emotional state, it was clear they had gone through a traumatic experience. In the end, the paramedics arrived and took both of them to the hospital. I stayed behind, watching as the wrecked sedan was towed away. It was another reminder of how dangerous that road could be, especially on nights like this, when the fog confuses even the most cautious drivers. I'd driven this stretch of rural road so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. It was one of those lonely back roads cutting through dense forests, where cell service disappeared, and the night felt darker than usual. However, something about this night had me on edge. The sky was clear, but the moon seemed larger and brighter than normal, casting long, disturbing shadows on the road. I was nearing the end of my shift when I received the call. It was a report about a power outage at a house on the outskirts of town, an abandoned farmhouse I knew well. Teenagers often told stories about that house, daring each other to spend the night there, but tonight didn't seem like a prank. The dispatcher's voice was tense, as if something wasn't right. There wasn't much detail, just strange sounds in the background and agitated breathing. I rubbed my eyes in exhaustion. The last thing I needed at midnight was to investigate an old rundown house, but I couldn't ignore the call. I turned my patrol car onto the dirt road leading to the farm. Trees lined the path like sentinels, and the air grew colder as I approached. When the headlights illuminated the property, I saw it, a structure that looked like it was about to collapse, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Weeds had overtaken the yard, and an old swing creaked as it swayed in the wind. The place looked like something out of a horror movie, but I couldn't let that get to me. I parked the patrol car and stepped out. The sound of gravel under my boots was the only thing breaking the silence. I walked toward the porch, which creaked under my weight. "Sheriff's Department," I called out loudly, but only the wind answered. I knocked on the door, and to my surprise, it opened with a long, worn-out groan. The inside of the house was worse than I imagined. The smell of damp and decay filled the air, and the floor was littered with debris. Yellowed newspapers, broken furniture, everything in disarray. As I walked through the place with my flashlight, something moved at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly but found only shadows. The radio on my belt crackled, making me jump. "Hernandez, everything okay?" asked the dispatcher. "Yeah, I'm inside," I replied, my voice tense. "No one seems to be here, but I'll keep checking." "Be careful," he warned me. "The signal is acting weird. We're getting interference." I continued to explore the house, the creak of the floorboards under my boots a constant sound. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, and with each step I took, it seemed like the place became more suffocating. I reached the stairs and stopped. I remembered the stories circulating in town. A family that lived here disappeared without a trace. No bodies were ever found, just rumors. Of course, I didn't believe in that stuff, but the house's atmosphere had me on edge. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, I saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Cautiously, I approached. Everything inside me told me not to go in, to leave the house, but I couldn't ignore what I had come to investigate. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was small, messy, with peeling wallpaper and scratch marks on the walls. In one corner, I made out a figure huddled, a girl, trembling, her tangled hair covering her face. I couldn't leave her there. "It's okay," I said, softening my tone. "I'm with the sheriff's department. Are you hurt?" The girl didn't respond, only rocked back and forth, hugging her knees. I took a step forward, but something wasn't right. The air in the room felt colder, and an uncomfortable sensation crept up my spine. At that moment, the girl lifted her head. I don't know what I expected to see, but what I saw wasn't it. Her eyes were filled with fear. They weren't empty eyes. They were those of someone who had been through something traumatic, someone who needed help. I approached slowly, not taking my eyes off her. "Let's get you out of here," I said, trying to get her to respond. Just as I was close enough to offer her my hand, I heard a loud bang behind me. I spun around in an instant and saw that the door to the room had closed by itself. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. My heart raced. I tried to stay calm and not alarm the girl. The house was old. Surely doors got stuck easily. But then I heard something downstairs, like someone else was in the house. "Stay here," I told the girl before heading back toward the door. I had no other choice. I had to get out of that room and find out who else was in the house. The door finally gave way and I hurried down the stairs, my hand near my gun just in case. But when I reached the bottom, there was no one. Only the same eerie silence that had followed me since I arrived. I don't know what really happened in that house that night, but one thing became clear. People thought that place was empty, but that girl, and probably others, had found refuge there in the worst of circumstances. My night shift had been quiet, almost monotonous, as I patrolled the empty streets of Valverde, the kind of night where there's barely any movement, and you stay awake purely out of routine. It had been hours without any incidents, and I was mentally preparing myself for a long night when the call came in. A woman reported seeing someone standing in the middle of the road near the old Arroyo Claro bridge. "He's just standing there watching me," she had said in a nervous voice. It wasn't a typical incident, but something in her tone put me on alert. I knew that bridge had a reputation in town, nothing more than legends repeated by teenagers. I didn't believe in such things, but still, the woman's story sounded too unsettling to ignore. I arrived at the indicated location within minutes. Fog covered the road, and the headlights from the patrol car barely illuminated a few meters ahead. The old, creaky bridge came into view, and then I saw him, a man standing in the middle of the bridge just as the woman had described. I slowed down and parked at a safe distance. I stepped out of the car, my hand resting on my holster. Something didn't feel right. The man, dressed in somewhat disheveled clothing, didn't seem to react to my arrival, as if he didn't care that he was standing in the middle of the road at that hour. The situation made me uneasy, so I called out for the first time. "Sir," I said in a firm voice, "I'm Officer Morales. I need you to step off the bridge for your safety." The man didn't respond. He remained still, staring at the ground. A bad feeling crept over me as I approached slowly. I didn't want to scare him, but I also couldn't leave him standing there. As I got closer, I noticed his hands were tense, as if he was holding something. My instincts told me to proceed with caution. "Sir, I'm speaking to you," I repeated, this time louder. Suddenly, the man lifted his head and our eyes met. His gaze was filled with a mix of confusion and desperation. He swayed slightly, and I realized something wasn't right. He wasn't dangerous. He seemed to be in an altered state, maybe under the influence of some substance or in the midst of an emotional crisis. "I need you to calm down, please." "I'm here to help," I said, softening my tone as I pulled out the radio to call for backup. I felt the situation could become unpredictable if I didn't act quickly. The man took a step toward me, his movements erratic. For a moment, I thought he might run or even attempt something violent, but his eyes told me he was lost, more scared than aggressive. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" I asked, maintaining a cautious distance. Finally he spoke, but what he said was confusing. He mumbled about someone following him, about being trapped and unable to escape. His behavior indicated that he was possibly experiencing a paranoid episode. Soon after, backup arrived, and as we tried to calm him down and get him to a safe place, it became clear he was having a psychological crisis. It turned out he had been missing for several hours, and his family had been searching for him, worried about his mental state. Officer Clara Mendoza had patrolled the same suburban neighborhood for years. It was a quiet place, the kind of area where the most exciting call would be a cat stuck in a tree or the occasional teenage prank. So, when the 911 call came in about strange noises coming from an old house in Valle Esperanza, she wasn't too worried. The house in question had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, boarded up and forgotten, with rumors circulating about homeless people or strangers using it as a temporary shelter. Clara thought that was all it was, but the dispatcher's voice trembled, uneasy. The caller said they'd heard a baby crying and claimed they were sure someone was inside, but no one lived there. "Officer Mendoza, be careful. A baby crying in that abandoned house isn't normal." Clara pushed aside the feeling of unease as she turned toward Valle Esperanza. The house came into view, a large, decrepit structure at the end of the road shrouded in darkness. The streetlights didn't reach that far, and her headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had rolled in. The windows were dark, covered in grime, the wood decaying, and the air around it heavy with neglect. She parked the patrol car and got out. The night was eerily quiet, except for the occasional whisper of leaves in the wind. Her flashlight flickered as she approached the house, the beam casting long, shifting shadows over the overgrown yard. She tried not to think about the stories she'd heard about the place. The times strange activity had been reported, like people entering and leaving without being seen, or lights in the middle of the night. Clara shook her head. None of that mattered. It was just another call. The gate squeaked loudly as she pushed it open, and her boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the front door. She stopped at the threshold, shining her flashlight on the boarded-up windows and broken shingles. Then she heard it. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. A baby crying. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just a sound in her head. It was real. She swallowed hard and knocked on the door, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Police, is anyone there?" There was no response. The crying continued, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Her heart pounded as she reached for the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open with a long groan. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and mold. The few remaining pieces of furniture were covered with white sheets, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, worn strips. It looked like no one had set foot in there for years, but the sound of the crying seemed to echo from the back of the house, reverberating through the empty rooms. "Hello," Clara called out, stepping into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence. She moved cautiously, her flashlight sweeping the space, revealing broken picture frames and overturned chairs. The crying grew louder, more urgent. Something about this felt wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she made her way toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the basement. She stopped at the top of the basement stairs. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness below was impenetrable. The crying was louder now, echoing from the depths like a plea for help. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back, to leave and call for backup, but she couldn't shake the idea that there was a child down there, alone and scared. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and descended the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger as she went down. The crying echoed off the cold stone walls, and Clara's flashlight flickered again, the beam stuttering in and out. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, cramped basement. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with old, rusted tools and boxes. In the corner was an old wooden crib, and inside the crib was a bundle of blankets. Her heart raced in her chest as she approached. The crying was now deafening, filling the space with its mournful wails. She reached out, her fingers trembling, as she touched the edge of the crib. Slowly, carefully, she pulled back the blanket. There was nothing, no baby, the crib was empty. The crying abruptly stopped, leaving the basement in suffocating silence. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Then she heard something else. Footsteps, but they weren't hers. The sound of a door opening upstairs made her freeze. She looked around, the shadows in the basement seeming to shift, and suddenly, Clara felt she wasn't alone. She rushed up the stairs, her flashlight swinging wildly. When she reached the top, the front door slammed shut. She ran toward it, but it was locked. Clara struggled, trying to open it, but it was no use. She heard noises, something moving on the floor above, heavy footsteps, and then it hit her. She wasn't alone. Someone else was in the house. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. But there was no response, only the sound of footsteps drawing closer. I'm not the kind of man who scares easily. 20 years on the force had toughened me. I'd seen almost everything. Murder scenes, missing persons, gang violence. But nothing could prepare me for what I found at number 8, Neblina Street. It all began as a routine case. I received a call about a disturbance at a rundown guest house on the outskirts of town. Neblina Street had been forgotten for decades, a place where people went to disappear, mostly drifters, the elderly, and those with nowhere else to go. When I arrived, I parked my car in front of the house. The rain started off light but soon turned into a downpour, turning the dirt road into a slippery mess. The house looked worse than I had imagined. Weeds had overtaken the yard, and the roof was so bowed it seemed ready to collapse at any moment. I got out of the car, feeling the rain pelt my jacket, and approached the entrance. I knocked on the door, but it opened on its own. As I stepped inside, a sour, decaying smell hit me immediately. "Mr. Ramirez," I called out, but only an eerie silence answered, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the roof. I walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I thought I heard a distant whisper, but I didn't pay it much attention. When I reached the living room, I found a messy scene. Overturned chairs, a broken mirror, and newspapers scattered across the floor. In one corner, a rocking chair was moving slowly, as if someone had just sat in it, though the room was empty. "Mr. Ramirez?" I called again, this time more firmly. The whispering stopped. I moved cautiously, my hand resting on the grip of my weapon. The house was old and decrepit, but there was something more, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. When I reached the stairs leading to the upper floors, I heard a rhythmic sound coming from above, like slow, deliberate footsteps going back and forth. I hesitated for a moment, but made my way up the stairs. Each step echoed louder than the last. The upstairs hallway was darker than the rest of the house, with the walls covered in water-damaged wallpaper. The sound continued, now louder, and seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hall. I approached the partially open door, and through the crack I saw movement in the shadows. "Mr. Ramirez?" I called out, but there was no response. I pushed the door open with my foot, and flashlight in hand illuminated the room. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was empty except for a bed in the center where Mr. Ramirez lay motionless, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. But it wasn't just his body that chilled my blood. It was what was written on the walls. Scribbles in a childlike handwriting. The words, "He won't let us out," covered every inch of the room, written in what appeared to be blood. The atmosphere was charged, and the tension filled every corner. Suddenly a terrifying thought crossed my mind. Had the old man been trapped here living a nightmare? That possibility sent a shiver down my spine. I decided I needed to get out of that house, but before I could take a step back, I heard a faint voice say, "He's coming." The voice was shaky and scared, and panic overtook me. I ran toward the door, but when I tried to open it, it slammed shut, as if someone were holding it closed. My heart pounded as I looked around, fear engulfing me. I shouted for help, but only the echo of my own voice answered me. I looked around, searching for a way out. The room felt more and more claustrophobic, and the heavy air made it hard to breathe. Without thinking, I broke the window with my elbow and jumped outside. The rain hit me as I ran toward my car, my heart still racing and adrenaline coursing through my veins. But as I drove away, I realized there was more to me than just fear. There was deep confusion. Days passed, and although I returned to the office, something had changed in me. Nightmares took over my nights. The image of Mr. Ramirez and the scribbles on the wall haunted me. I began to question my own sanity. I replayed my memories of that night, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. It wasn't just the place that terrified me. It was the implications of what I had seen, the weight of the lives that had been lost in that house. Eventually, I decided to take a step back. Leaving the force was the hardest decision of my life, but I knew I needed to get away. The job, which had been my life for so long, had become an echo of my own nightmares. Though I never spoke of what happened at number 8 Neblina Street, I kept those images and sounds to myself. In time, I realized that the pressure of the years had left a mark on me, and the experience in that house was the catalyst that pushed me to seek professional help. Despite everything, I'm grateful for the change. My life is different now, more focused on the present and more aware of my mental health. Sometimes when I walk down the street, I see elderly people passing by and think of Mr. Ramirez and those who, like him, struggle in silence. His story is a reminder that not all fears are visible and that the real battle can be in the mind. I'm Officer Beatrice Salazar, and I've been patrolling the desolate roads of this small town for 6 years, working the night shift. The nights are usually long, cold, and quiet, especially near Old Martinez Road, which leads to nowhere and is rarely traveled by any cars after dark. That night started like any other. My radio was silent, the streets empty, and the only sound was the hum of my patrol car's engine as I made my rounds. Around midnight, I received a call from the dispatcher that sent a chill down my spine. "Salazar, we've received a report of a problem at an old barn near Martinez Road. Can you check it out?" I frowned. That area had been abandoned for years. The barn they mentioned was boarded up and in ruins with the roof half collapsed. I remembered the stories that a family had once lived there, but they had disappeared without a trace. The townspeople avoided the place out of fear, so I knew it wouldn't be anything good. Still, a call is a call. I replied, "I'm on my way." The road was long and winding, the trees closing in on both sides, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands under the moonlight. Fog covered the path, and when I finally reached the barn, I felt like I was on the edge of something unsettling. The building looked even more dilapidated than I remembered. Broken windows, the front door hanging from its hinges. I got out of my patrol car, my boots sinking into the wet grass. An unnatural silence hung in the air. There were no insect sounds or rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I approached the barn, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the porch, I called out, "Police, is anyone here?" There was no response. I pushed the door open and it creaked loudly, revealing the empty interior of the barn. The air smelled of dampness and decay. Even though the place seemed abandoned, something felt off. As I walked around the ground floor, I found no one. But after a short time, I heard a faint noise like someone was softly tapping on the walls from upstairs. I hesitated at the base of the stairs. "Is someone there?" I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The tapping stopped. I swallowed hard and began climbing the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me and I noticed the air was much colder. I approached the first door, pushing it open cautiously. The bedroom was empty, but the old toys scattered across the floor gave me a sense of unease. I decided to move on. The tapping had started again, and this time it was coming from a room at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened as I approached the last door. I opened it and found a small chair in the center. It was an old rocking chair, slowly moving even though there wasn't a breeze to push it. As I examined the room, I suddenly noticed movement in the shadows. My heart stopped when I saw a hooded figure hiding in a corner, preparing to attack me. I couldn't believe it. There was someone inside the barn. Terror gripped me and I felt time slow down. "Don't come any closer," I shouted, trying to stay calm. But the intruder moved toward me, their face distorted by a mixture of rage and desperation. Without thinking, I stepped back and stumbled over the chair, falling to the floor as I tried to regain my balance. The sound of the radio came to life again, but I barely heard it. "Officer Salazar, do you copy?" The dispatcher's voice sounded tense, as if they could sense the danger through the line. "Yes, I'm here," I responded, but my voice was shaking. "Are you still at the barn?" asked the dispatcher. "Yes, I need help," I shouted. At that moment, the intruder lunged at me. I could hear their heavy breathing as they tried to grab my arms. Taking advantage of the confusion, I quickly got up and ran toward the door with the man close behind. I rushed out of the barn and into my patrol car, starting the engine with trembling hands. The fog seemed to recede as I sped away. Back at the station, I filed my report and waited for backup to arrive. When they finally reached the barn, they found the place empty, with no sign of the intruder. After a thorough search, they didn't even find any clues that anyone had been there. Since that night, the old barn has been etched into my memory. I never returned to Martinez Road. However, from time to time, while patrolling the outskirts of town, I feel that something dark lurks in the fog, and I know that story isn't over. I had always heard the rumors about the Deep Shadow Woods, a vast and dense ancient forest just outside my town. Teenagers dared each other to go in at night and whispered about strange sightings for generations. However, I wasn't the type to believe in local legends. After all, I had been a cop for over 10 years and had seen firsthand how rumors could turn into hysteria. But one autumn night, as the sun set behind the horizon, I received a call that made me reconsider my skepticism. It was a frantic hiker who had been exploring the outskirts of Deep Shadow. Her voice shook with panic as she tried to explain what had happened. "My friend is gone. We were walking on the trail and she just disappeared. I heard her scream and then nothing. Please, you have to help." I arrived at the edge of the forest just as dusk fell. The air was crisp and the woods were eerily silent. Normally you'd hear the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. But that night it felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I parked my patrol car and got out, flashlight in hand, scanning the thick tree line in front of me. The hiker, a young woman in her 20s, was near the trailhead, her face pale and hands trembling. "Where did you last see her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed toward the path. "We were about 2 kilometers in, she was right behind me, and then she screamed. I turned around, but she was gone. There was nothing there, not even a footprint. Please, you have to find her." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "Stay here, I'll call for backup and take a look." I started walking down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder and an unsettling feeling settled in my gut. But every time I looked over my shoulder there was nothing, only shadows. About 2 kilometers in, I came to a small clearing where the ground was covered in dry leaves. I slowed down, looking for any sign of the missing woman. My flashlight beam swept the ground, but there were no marks, no footprints. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Then something caught my eye, a faint glint among the leaves. I knelt down and brushed them aside, revealing a silver bracelet partially buried as if someone had tried to cover it up. My stomach churned. This must have belonged to the missing hiker. Just then, a noise echoed through the trees, the sound of branches snapping. I turned around, alert. I felt that someone was near, and before I could react, I saw a shadow moving between the trees. I quickly drew my gun, staying on high alert as I moved toward the source of the sound. "Police!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the stillness of the forest. As I approached, I came across a figure advancing toward me, behaving suspiciously. It was a scruffy-looking man, and his gaze was intense and threatening. The tension in the air grew thicker. "Where is the woman?" I asked him, trying to sound firm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he responded, trying to slowly back away. I didn't take my eyes off him. "Stop. You're a suspect in the disappearance of that woman." The man, realizing he couldn't escape, lunged at me with the intent to attack. I reacted quickly, using my training to subdue him and keep the situation under control. As I restrained him, he began to scream, revealing that the missing woman had been trapped in a snare he had set in the woods to catch animals. Still holding the man in custody, I began searching for the missing woman. Finally, I found her in a small cave, dazed but unharmed. After rescuing her, the man was arrested and taken into custody. As we returned to town, I looked at the forest, now so familiar and yet so mysterious. It had been a night of revelations, a night when the rumors had come to life in a terrifying way. It was a quiet night in the small town of Ashton Falls. I had been with the local police department for over 15 years and thought I had seen it all. Domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional robbery, nothing out of the ordinary for a rural community. But everything changed the night I received a call that would stay with me forever. It started like any other shift. I was patrolling the outskirts of town when, just past midnight, I got a call. "Unit 15, we've received a 911 call from the old Miller house," said the dispatcher, her voice unusually tense. The call mentioned strange noises but gave no further details. The Miller house had been abandoned for years after a tragic fire that claimed the lives of the entire family. Locals said it was uninhabited, but I didn't believe in stories. Still, it had become a notorious spot for teenagers and drifters, so I assumed someone was lurking around. As I arrived at the neglected entrance, my headlights barely illuminated the dilapidated structure in the distance. The wind blew through the trees as I approached, my hand hovering uncertainly over my holster. The front door was ajar, creaking in the breeze. As I stepped inside, a musty smell hit me. The decay was mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the only sound was my own breathing. "Police, is anyone here?" I called out, but there was no response. I ventured further into the house, lighting up the oppressive darkness with my flashlight. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood. The walls were charred from the fire years ago, blackened and twisted, as if the very structure had been scarred by the tragedy that had occurred there. Then, a sound, a faint moan, barely audible, came from upstairs. My heart raced as I slowly climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, the moan turned into a muffled sob. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of what seemed to be a child's bedroom. The door was slightly open, and through the crack I saw a figure hunched in the corner facing away from me. It appeared to be a young woman with dark hair hanging down, covering her face. "Ma'am," I said cautiously, pushing the door open with my foot. "Are you okay?" There was no response. The sobbing continued. I moved closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but as I got nearer, a strange unease crept over me. The woman stopped sobbing, and a wave of discomfort washed over me. At that moment, she slowly turned. Her face was visibly gaunt, with sunken eyes and an expression of utter despair. I stepped back, my heart pounding. She lunged toward me, and in reflex, I pulled away, trying to defuse the situation. "What's wrong? You're safe," I shouted, trying to calm her down. I realized she wasn't a threat, but someone in desperate need of help. The woman began sobbing again, and I could see she was clearly terrified. "I don't want to be here," she said through her tears. The urgency in her voice made me realize I needed to act fast. "We're going to get out of here, okay? I'm here to help you," I said as I guided her toward the exit. As we moved away, a faint noise echoed behind us, like something shifting in the shadows. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. My priority was getting this woman out of the house. I led her to the safety of my patrol car and called for backup. While we waited, I asked her questions. She told me she had been living in the house, trying to escape her past, but the shadows of her previous life haunted her. It was a case of abandonment and desperation, a far cry from the ghost stories I'd heard about the house. When backup arrived, the rest of the night was spent ensuring the woman got the help she needed. In the end, I sat in my patrol car, reflecting on what had happened. For the past 3 months, news about the Facebook killer has been all over the internet. It even caught the attention of some international media, and this case has been spiraling out of control pretty quickly. This past February, a new Facebook account was created in Georgia. At first, it was like any normal account of someone named FBK. However, soon the user began posting photos of the bodies of the people they had killed. The user tagged all of the victims' friends and family, and that's how we came to know the Facebook killer. As a detective, I got fully involved in the case from day one. When the first report was filed at this very police station, I was assigned the responsibility of handling the case. But from that day until now, the Facebook killer has murdered 7 people and posted about each killing on their Facebook account, and we, as police officers, could do nothing. This happened during the early days of Facebook when it was just starting to gain popularity, so the digital forensics department struggled to trace the killer's location. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk in the police station doing some paperwork. Most of the station was empty since most of the officers had gone home. At that time, I was around 33 years old and single. So when a stunning woman walked into the police station and sat in the chair in front of my desk, I was a little taken aback. She had beautiful blonde hair, dark brown eyes, and a gorgeous figure. But what I noticed a little late was the fact that she was crying. "How can I help you, ma'am? What happened? Why are you crying?" I asked, my natural protective instincts kicking in. "You have to arrest me right now," the woman said as tears streamed down her face. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened? Why should I arrest you?" "Because I can't stop, I can't control myself," she continued, sobbing uncontrollably. "You can't control what?" This was getting more and more confusing with every passing minute. I killed my mother, our driver, and the gardener, and you need to lock me up. I can't stop. I have a strong urge to kill. Please help me, detective, she begged, crying at my desk. However, I struggled to believe what I was hearing. Why would someone turn themselves in after committing murder, let alone beg to be jailed? Maybe this woman was mentally unstable and needed help. Ma'am, are you saying you killed 3 people? Can you tell me where the bodies are so we can confirm their deaths and proceed to arrest you? She seemed to understand that. Now, if she was mentally ill, she could be lying about the deaths. So we had to see the bodies to figure out if she was lying or if she was truly mentally unstable. Well, can you take me to your house where the bodies are? I asked as patiently and carefully as I could. Being a detective had taught me enough about how to handle these matters. She paused for a moment and then said, "Sure, detective. I knew it would be wise to take some officers with me in case there really were bodies, so I asked Steve and Marcus to accompany me to the woman's house." A few minutes later, we pulled up in front of a large mansion on the outskirts of the city. "Is this your house?" I asked the woman beside me. She hadn't stopped crying, which was starting to get a bit annoying at this point. "Yes, this is my house." The 4 of us got out and entered the property. "Where are the bodies, ma'am?" I asked. "I buried the gardener and the driver in the backyard," she said as she began walking toward what I assumed was the backyard. Steve, Marcus, and I followed her. We stopped in front of 2 huge pits, about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. The pits were covered with dirt, but anyone could easily tell they weren't just piles of dirt, but unmarked graves. "The bodies are down there," she confirmed. "And where is your mother's body?" The woman began to cry even harder when I mentioned her mother. It was evident that she had really killed her mother and was now regretting her action. Either way, I had to find the body and call for backup. "Please come with me, detective. I'll show you where her body is." "After you." I followed her 2 floors up in the mansion when suddenly she stopped and pointed with a trembling finger toward a room at the end of the hallway. I cautiously walked toward the room and opened the door. It was a well-decorated room but dimly lit, so I couldn't see a body there. I entered the room and still didn't find the body. That's when I saw another door in a corner. It must be the bathroom, and that's probably where the body was. I entered the bathroom, and before I could comprehend what was happening, a knife pierced my back. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't pay enough attention to what was happening outside the room. The knife was at an awkward angle, and my hands couldn't reach it. The only thing I could hear was her sharp laughter. "I got you, detective. I got you before you could catch me." She laughed and laughed with no trace of the earlier tears. The only thing I could do was try to get out of the bathroom and into the main room. "I heard you were looking for the Facebook killer, right? You were investigating my case, weren't you? But poor detective, no luck for you. I bet you didn't expect the killer to be a woman. There's no gardener or driver out there, you know? There's no body in the bathroom either. I just wanted to get you alone so I could finally kill the detective who was sniffing around my trail like an obedient dog. But it turns out you're not that good at your job after all." She kept talking and talking about how she had caught me and how she was smarter than me, while I lay there on the floor, face down. I was bleeding out, and I knew I would die if I didn't do something. I knew my men downstairs wouldn't hear my cries for help and that backup wouldn't arrive in time. I knew I was going to die, so I decided to ask her a question that had haunted me since I took on this case. "Why did you kill all those people? Why are you killing me now?" "Oh, detective, don't you get it? It's simply fun to kill. It's incredible to see the life drain from my victims. You know, it's so fun watching you die right now." She laughed even more and sat in a chair, watching me die. That's when, with my last breath, I pressed the panic button on my cell phone, and seconds later, I lost consciousness. A few weeks later, I woke up in a hospital. I don't know how they saved me or who did. All I knew was that the Facebook killer had been caught, and that I was alive to tell the story of how I nearly died in the line of duty at the hands of a serial killer. Hi guys, my name is Alberto. I'm a police officer, but I'm currently on vacation because what I experienced a few days ago was so traumatic, so horrible, that I'm still surprised I haven't left this job for good and started doing something else. You see, I've always been a very fearful person. I know it sounds ridiculous for someone like me to be a cop with a personality like that, but I wanted to prove something to myself. I wanted to overcome my fears and help society. Nothing and no one was going to tell me that I couldn't do it. Although at first I was still a little scared, my training gave me more confidence, and little by little I managed to overcome my fears and become the officer I wanted to be. But there was one day when my badge, my training, and my bravery were useless, and the worst thing happened to me in the place where I least expected it. That day, I had already returned to the police station. We had arrested a man, something strange. When we were called, the victim was terrified. She told us that the man was a psychopath, a cruel, violent, bloodthirsty monster. When we arrived at the scene, we met both the victim and the criminal. The man was over 6 feet tall, standing there looking at us with indifference. He didn't seem dangerous, but when we saw the victim, we took it seriously. She wasn't hurt, but her eyes were wide open from shock. She didn't react to our presence, just stared at the criminal as if he were the devil himself. We arrested the man and took him to the police station. I have to admit, it was the calmest transfer we've ever had. Not only did he not resist, but he also quietly obeyed everything we told him. We didn't understand what was going on, but both my partner and I felt a very unpleasant sensation. We just wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. When we got to the station, I was ordered to lock him up in one of the temporary cells. He'd probably be there for 24 hours, unless the victim gave us a good reason to hold him longer, though I saw that as unlikely since when we left, she just asked us to take him as far away from her as possible. I was leading the man to the cell, but at that moment the worst thing that could happen occurred. It had started raining a little while earlier, and due to a thunderclap, the power went out in the entire station and across the block. In that moment of confusion, I felt someone slam into me, knocking me to the ground. The strange man who had been walking with me toward the cell was no longer with me. I could hear his footsteps running through the station, but they weren't heading toward the office. They were going deeper into the station. I thought about running to tell my colleagues, but I couldn't take that risk. The reason the criminal escaped was because I was distracted. A police officer can't make those kinds of mistakes. I had to fix it without anyone knowing. In the dark, I pulled out my gun and followed him toward the office. This definitely wasn't my lucky day because the offices were under renovation. I entered the empty office, ready to shoot, wondering where this man could be hiding. Part of me was terrified. I was locked in a dark office with a man of very strange nature, a man who had traumatized someone so much that they didn't even want to press charges, only wanting him far away from their home. But I couldn't allow myself to be afraid. I was the police officer, the person trained to defend myself, the person with a gun, and it certainly wasn't me who was running away in handcuffs. I continued searching with my gun in hand, hearing the voices of the other officers gathering at the entrance or heading outside to see if there was any light. Slowly I realized I was becoming more and more alone since no one had any reason to stay in the dark or to look for anyone. Suddenly I started hearing footsteps in front of me. They were slow and intense, but what terrified me most about them was that they were purposeful. They weren't the steps of someone trying to escape or hide. At that moment, I realized this person hadn't entered the office to hide from me, but to trap me. I was the victim. I was the one who should be afraid, not him. The slow footsteps began to pick up speed. The man was running toward me, zigzagging. After a warning, I fired 2 shots and the steps stopped. Had I hit him? As soon as I took a step to investigate in the darkness, someone violently tackled me. The man used his cuffed arms to grab and squeeze me tightly. My gun fell to the floor from the force he exerted on me, and in one swift motion he grabbed me from behind and choked me even harder. I tried to resist, but it was useless. This person's strength was enormous, and to make things worse, he seemed to be trained or knowledgeable in martial arts as I couldn't break free. The man gradually tightened his arms, making me realize that he wasn't even using all of his strength. When I least expected it, when I was about to pass out, the man let out a huge scream in my ear, leaving me stunned. I lost all my courage. I tried to scream as loudly as I could, but it came out as a dry gasp. The door behind us opened, and in a second, many flashlights were shining on the man, who didn't seem to give up and squeezed me even harder. The officers were about to shoot him, but suddenly the lights came back on. At that moment, the man raised his head and simply let me go, crouching down and adopting the same passive posture as before. The officers arrested him, and I fell to the ground crying. The nightmare was over. The man was arrested for assaulting an officer, and I started my forced vacation. While I was at home, I found out that the man began receiving several visits from a woman who seemed to treat him with great confidence and excitement. This woman was the same one who had reported him, the one we found at her house in a state of panic. We discovered that this woman had no relationship with the psychopath, and shortly afterward, we learned she was writing a book about him. There are things I can't explain, like the power outage or why the man calmed down when he saw the lights. But part of me felt that all of this was planned, and that the woman may not have been the victim we thought she was.